Welcome to Author Stories, the podcast where we talk to the best writers in the industry and discuss writing and the creative process. Whether you're a writer, a reader, or both, we hope you'll find something here that makes you love books and the writers that create them. You can find archives of all of the great conversations I've had with authors over the years at hankgarner.com. Take some time and browse around there. I'm sure you'll find a new author to love, find inspiration for your own creative life, and find a new story to get lost in. Let's thank some sponsors who make the show possible. As the Crow Flies, enter Haddon Wood, Book 1 by Risa Walker and Caleb Ansel. From Risa Walker, the award-winning author of the best-selling Chronos Files, and debut author Caleb Ansel, comes a chilling story of altered reality and psychological terror. Chase Ray sits perfectly still, his thumbs traveling across the screen of the broken computer tablet, stuck in the nexus between two worlds. Haddon Wood isn't real. It can't be. Another world, another reality, hovers just beyond his reach. He can see it sometimes. He can almost touch it. In that world, things are in balance. The dead stay dead and the creature feature remains safely on the screen. That world isn't a patchwork quilt of every scary book or movie he's seen. In that world, the nightmares generally end when you open your eyes and people don't glitch in and out of existence. Chase is determined to return to that world, although he's a bit worried that the only way out is through the noose that seems to lurk around every corner. He needs allies to get back home. But how do you choose your team when you can't tell who's real? As the Crow Flies, enter Haddon Wood, Book 1 by Risa Walker and Caleb Ansel. Simon Says, the John Simon Thriller, Book 1 by Brian Thomas Schmidt. Master Detective John Simon is a tough, streetwise 17-year veteran of the Kansas City Police Department with a healthy disdain for the encroachment of modern technology into his workplace. When his partner is kidnapped after a routine stakeout by thugs with seeming ties to connected, wealthy art dealer Benjamin Ashman, he's determined to find the truth. But the only witness is a humanoid android named Lucas George. Reluctantly, he takes Lucas along as he begins to investigate and soon finds himself depending more and more on the very technology he so distrusts. Meanwhile, Simon's precocious teenage daughter begins to teach Lucas how to sound more like a cop using dialogue from famous cop movies. If only he'd used them in the appropriate context. This exciting new mix of near-future science fiction and procedural thriller captures the gritty realism of Michael Connelly's Bosch, the humor and action of Lethal Weapon, and follows the classic science fiction tradition of Isaac Asimov's City of Steel. From the editor of the international best-selling phenomenon The Martian by Andy Weir, and the national best-selling author of tales including official entries in The X-Files, Predator, and the Joe Ledger thrillers, comes the action-packed first entry in an exciting new series. Be sure to pick up Simon Says by Brian Thomas Schmidt and get into the series on the ground floor. Vedic by K.J. Heritage. The dead don't always die. Top company scientist Chin Jelinek has committed suicide. Vedic, a half-alive empath with no memory of who or what he is, will die in 6 hours if he can't find out why, or so the company tells him, an added incentive to get the job done. Our hero soon discovers he is one of the skilled, a genetically enhanced human revered and despised in equal measure, a bloodhound with a terrifying past who'll stop at nothing in his pursuit of the truth. And the skilled always get their guy, don't they? Vedic, number 1 by K.J. Heritage, on sale now. There's a link to it in the show notes. K.J. Heritage's uncanny sense of pacing and story puts him at the forefront of today's speculative fiction writers. Gritty, intense, and compelling, Vedic is something you don't run into often enough in sci-fi, a cerebral thrill ride you don't want to end. Prepare to lose sleep reading Vedic, delicious science fiction. That's what other people are saying about it. Find out for yourself. Vedic, the first book in the series by K.J. Heritage. The Unwelcome Trilogy by R.D. Brady. survivor, mother, leader, and humanity's last chance. Deep within the remnants of the United States, Lila Richards oversees a camp of 200 survivors. In a world where living is an everyday struggle, and only through banding together can people survive, the arrival of the unwelcome only made her job harder. Riley Quinn and Miles Jones have been raised by Lila for the last 5 years. They're also one of the cursed, the children between the ages of 13 and 18, whom the unwelcome kill on sight. No questions, no pleas, just death. Protecting one another and the people of their camp is ingrained in all of them. But now each of them faces increased danger as the reason why the cursed have been targeted by the unwelcome slowly comes to light. And that truth will shock them to their core. Now time is running out, not just for the cursed who are being hunted down by the unwelcome, not just for Lila and her family who will face the greatest challenge yet, but for all of humanity. The world changed radically 35 years ago, but today humanity's very existence is on the line, and the fight has begun that will ensure its future or its annihilation. Fans of A.G. Riddle, James Rollins, Suzanne Collins, and Brandon Sanderson will love the Unwelcome Trilogy. Pick up your copy of the Unwelcome Trilogy on Amazon today. Well, thanks for joining me again for the Author Stories podcast, where I bring you the story behind the stories and the storytellers. Today, I'm really excited to have Georgie Blalock on the show with me today. She has a brand new book. It's called The Other Windsor Girl, a Novel of Princess Margaret, Royal Rebel. And when you're hearing this on Monday, those of you that are fans of the Netflix series The Crown, the new season came out yesterday, and this is a great time to pick up this book. I think you're going to love it. Welcome to the show, Georgie.
Thank you so much for having me on.
I'm excited to have you. Georgie, we begin each show with the same question, and that question is, what is your first memory of wanting to be a writer or storyteller?
Oh, wow. The one that stands out the most is in 6th grade, there was a short story contest at my school. And at the time, I was very interested in Greek mythology and history, and this myth kind of just came to me. And I wrote it, and I won the contest. And I think that was the one that stands out the most for me in regard. After that, there was that constant kind of intertwining of history and wanting to write until I'm here today.
Excellent. Were you a bookish kid?
Yes. But I was always in the nonfiction history section of the bookstore. So I did love fiction, but I was cruising the 941 section of the British history of the library long time ago.
I love that you that you kind of staked your claim on the Dewey Decimal System there.
I do. It was my friend.
I love it. Where do you think that love of history comes from? Was this something instilled in your family? Is it just in your DNA? Can you put your finger on where you think it comes from?
I think it was something that was instilled by my family because my dad's very into the genealogy, and I just remember Christmases, and you'd sit around with the family, and they would always talk about the past and things that had happened and their stories. And then my parents had been to Europe for a couple months before I was born, and they had this great collection in their office of history books. And I used to go in there and just, devour the ones that really spoke to me, which were always either the ancient world or a British history. And I had free reign with that, and it was always encouraged and something that I was allowed to indulge in.
That's fantastic. I think, adults, parents especially, don't always realize the impact that our hobbies and interests have on our kids, and just, the small amount of work that it takes to just not obstruct their interest in what we do
exactly.
Is amazing, and you just never know where that's going to lead.
No, you don't, and it's great to be able to have that freedom and encouragement when you're young, because you never know where it's going to take you.
Exactly. What about you're always interested in history and not living in the past but visiting those time periods. When did that start taking on the shape of writing stories, set in the past?
That took a little bit longer to come because my other great love was movies. And so in college and in my early career, I actually pursued screenwriting and wanted to be a screenwriter. And so I moved to Los Angeles and I worked in the business up there. And I continued with the love of history because I wanted to keep that as a hobby, as something that I would be allowed to love and I wouldn't eventually come to, hate because it was a quote-unquote job. And what happened is after a number of years working in Los Angeles, when the screenwriting, it's a very tough industry, and it really wasn't going the way I would have liked, I was sitting down reading a historical romance novel one day, and I thought, I could write one of these. And so I did. I sat down, and that's really when the history began to really come into my writing because my background is actually as a romance writer under the name Georgie Lee. And so I've written about 15 books for Harlequin, historical, and then, now I'm transitioning into the historical fiction and really just being able to take that love of history and the love of research and to just mine history for all the great stories it has and all the great characters and all the wonderful things that are happening and turn it into something that's very, accessible for people. And a way to take people on a journey that's just very different than their own life and allows them to kind of just escape for a while.
The a lot of the books that you've written as Georgie Lee are Regency romance. What is it about that time period that you love?
That time period is the Jane Austen era, so you get the manners and the dress and that sense of elegance, which is so much fun to watch. And you think about the Pride and Prejudice movies and just how, lush they are and fun. But one of the other things I was able to do was in the Regency was also look at some of the different aspects of it that you wouldn't be as aware of. So some of the characters I've done in the past there are merchants and railroad people and just a female fossil hunter. And just, being able to explore more of the stories than just the Duke in his manor house or the Mr. Darcy, which is great. I love that too. But it's also fun to mine that history for other inspiration and things that maybe people haven't heard of or considered before.
Kind of a subversive Regency romance writer, always bringing in the extra history that people didn't know they wanted.
Right, exactly.
I love it. As a history fan, and also, a fan of novels of that time period, do you ever read like a Regency romance and just kind of roll your eyes because people get the history all wrong?
Yeah, there's always that. And I think that's kind of something that comes into all sort of historical stuff because it is fiction in the end.
Yeah.
And sometimes you play fast and loose with it and it works. And every once in a while you do stop and go, I don't know about that. But that's kind of the fun of it too, I think, is trying to imagine how things might have also played out and the possibilities that might have existed. Because the truth is we don't know everything.
Right.
We know the big sweeps, but when it came to people's everyday life, sometimes you look at it and think, well, what's to say that couldn't have happened? But there are leaps sometimes that you just look at and go, And then you have to decide from there, I'm going to keep rolling with it, or, and it's up to each reader.
Yeah. Your love of film and your pursuit of screenwriting is very evident when you read The Other Windsor Girl, because it's a very cinematic book if we can kind of merge those two worlds.
Sure.
But your descriptions are fantastic, and the way that you portray characters. What is your favorite film, and what do you think of as the epitome of great screen storytelling?
Oh, well, my favorite film is Gone with the Wind. That is one I love. And one of the things I loved about that was the Scarlet O'Hara, the tomorrow is another day. That sense of no matter what life throws at you, you pick yourself up and you keep on going. And that is something I think ends up in a lot of my characters. It's certainly one that ends up in Vera Strathmore, who's the heroine in The Other Windsor Girl. She's the girl that becomes the second lady in waiting to Princess Margaret. And I think that sense of always going on no matter what happens, not letting things defeat you, not, being upset when you need to be, but still picking yourself and going on. It's a central theme to this book and to a lot of my other books. And so, yeah, that's definitely one of my favorite. And one of the things I think about movies that I also really look for is that character in there that you can identify with, that there's something about that character that you see yourself in them. And through their journey, you kind of take your own journey in a way, but also that you have that moment where you look at it and you think, there's somebody who gets whatever that experience is that I've also been through too, or the reader's also been through too, and you feel that sense of connection to whoever it is that's writing it and creating that. And I think that's one of the great things about films and novels, is being able to see a part of yourself or a part of your own life journey in a character or a story.
When you started writing novels from screenwriting, did you find it more liberating to kind of be in charge of the entire process? What was it? What did novel writing do for you that screenwriting couldn't?
It was a bit of a transition because, in screenplay, you're really dealing with that dialogue. And even though there's direction and there's some you put some clues to things in there, you don't flesh it out. And it was a bit of a transition to go from that very succinct kind of writing to the much deeper descriptions and really getting in there. And so with my first novel, that took a little bit of, that was a learning curve. And I really had to learn how to do that. And I do tend to write short and succinct, so I do have to stop a lot of times, because I also I know a lot of people like to do the first draft, and that's what they really like. I really like the editing, the going in and the layering and just continuing to work with the story. And so I always have to remember as I'm going through to go in there and add more detail and to really flesh things out, because it was a bit of a transition, but it was also fun, like you said, to be able to really get into the characters and see things from their point of view and feel their emotions and know that it was me, or it is me, who is creating that emotion as opposed to an actor or a director or somebody like that. Is having that control is also really nice, and that was a bit of a shift. And now I couldn't actually imagine going back to screenwriting after doing this. I don't think I could go back to being quite that succinct, or like you said, losing that control.
Right. My friend Steve Bowyer calls it onioning, where you write a quick scene and then go back and add layer upon layer until it's fully fleshed out. Do you work from an outline, or is that first layer, does that kind of act as an outline as you're writing that first draft?
I do synopses, and they're usually about 8 pages, and I try and get the emotional stuff in there and that progression of the character. And then as I'm writing, things change. Some other character comes in, or something I didn't think about in the synopsis pops up, and I'll explore it. But initially, there's usually a synopsis. And then also usually it kind of sort of comes to me as the opening scene. Is whatever that opening scene is that usually helps define the character and whatever their conflict is. So whatever that first chapter is, for me, usually helps clarify everything so that I can then keep it in mind as I'm going through the story and then heading towards the dark moment and the resolution.
When you're writing Regency romance, I would imagine that the creative process, kind of working with that original kernel of an idea. We all have a thing that kicks it off, whether it's the idea of a character, maybe a scenario, maybe an historical event that then we want to, tell the deeper story around.
Right.
Whatever it is, they kind of begin that way. But with the character of Princess Margaret, someone that we all are at least loosely familiar with, obviously not as much as her sister, but if you've been alive for a couple of decades, you can't help but be exposed to the royal family. So when you're dealing with a character that is real, and how does a story begin to evolve around a real character?
For me, in this story, it was creating the fictional character of Vera Strathmore. and bringing somebody in who had not been in that world, who had not seen everything behind the curtain, who didn't know everything that we all know, and then being there as these things unfold and then having it impact her life. So she was a very important character for getting into the world of Princess Margaret, in that seeing it through her eyes, it's like seeing it fresh and new in a way that maybe people haven't seen it before or they aren't aware of. And then it also allowed me to take some liberties, because in the end it's fiction, and in the end my character of Princess Margaret is my character. I try and stay as true as I can to the historical Princess Margaret, but she is also my character, just like all the other ones are. And so being able to tweak her a little bit here and there was very fun. I enjoyed that as well. But then also staying true to the things she did. I mean, she had such an interesting life that there was a lot there to mine. But being able to come at it from fresh eyes in the character of Vera really helped get in there and help develop the story.
Was there something that drew you to the character of Margaret and her sort of universe that revolves around her? What was it that brought her to the forefront?
That time period, because the book takes place from 1949 when she's 19, and it ends in 1959, right at her engagement and marriage to Anthony Armstrong Jones. And that's a very interesting time period in history, because you still have a little bit of that Downton Abbey world left. Not a lot. I mean, it's on life support at that point. But it still exists, especially for Princess Margaret, because the royal family at that time were firmly entrenched in that Downton Abbey world.
The whole upstairs, downstairs kind of, yeah.
And the aristocracy and what that meant, because I read a lot of things that said that if her father had lived longer, he would have pushed her towards marriage to one of the sons of a duke that was in her circle of friends, and that he would have kind of had her set up as a duchess with a lot of lands and manor houses and that sense of history. And that's very much a world that was coming to an end at that time. But it hadn't ended yet. And she's fascinating because she gets caught in that. She gets caught in that old world. And I think she wanted to change, and she wanted those options that were starting to come up, and that would be there by the 60s, but that were not there for her. And so she's sort of this oddly tragic figure, especially since that she and her sister were never meant to be in the positions that they were in. You know, when their uncle abdicated, suddenly they became the heirs, and they were never supposed to be that. They were supposed to go off and have very quiet lives out of the spotlight. And suddenly that all changed. And when it did change, Margaret, as the second daughter, ended up in a position where, truthfully, nobody really knew what to do with her. If there'd been two sons, a king and then the younger brother, he could have gone into the military, just like her father did. He could have had a career. But as a princess, especially one that did not follow initially the path of, marry a duke's son and become a duchess, nobody really knew what to do with her. And she ended up being so overlooked on such a public scale. And the amount of frustration that then creates and the problems is just this very fascinating character and a fascinating theme to explore.
When you started, well, first off, what sort of research did you do to, get the big set piece events and all of that for this time period? Were there certain sources you used, and were there things you were looking for specifically that you knew would be pillars of the story?
I went and grabbed every book I could on Princess Margaret, and I read through all of those. Every book I could on life in Buckingham Palace, and also anybody who was alive at that time and a significant, and maybe not, sometimes not even a significant figure, but had knowledge of that world and what it was like to live at that time and to be around her. And so that was where I did a lot of the research with biographies. And then I also have a subscription to the British Newspaper Archive. And so I would go in there and take a look at newspaper articles, also to get a sense of how people viewed her at the time, so that when I was writing the character of Vera, I could see how she might approach the princess. And so there was just a lot of the historical stuff to work with that was a lot of fun to mine, because when you start reading about what was going on And The Crown does a really good job, the TV series, of showing how even though it's the queen and she's the princess, it was the old mustached men who were sort of running everything, and how despite them both having this massive amounts of quote-unquote power, they really didn't. And I thought that was very fascinating.
Yeah. As you've mentioned a couple of times, the character that really brings the story alive is Vera. How did you come up with her, and tell me a little bit about building her backstory so that she becomes this character that we're also really fascinated by and engaged with?
Where did she come from? That's a good question. Because sometimes, characters just sort of appear.
They just show up. Yeah.
They just show up. And I think that's kind of how she was, is that she just showed up. And I think in the very, very, very first part, she was a little different. And then I went through another sort of brainstorming, and the idea of having someone who is trying to find their purpose and place in life in a way that, same with Princess Margaret, very much appealed to me. And so as I was doing the research about World War the London after World War II and things like that, the idea of how much World War II had changed everything. I liked the idea that, you have this young woman who had this whole life sort of planned out, and then all of a sudden World War II changed that. And now she's struggling to find purpose, struggling to find place, struggling to find respect in her family, which, as many of the things that Princess Margaret was struggling with as well. And that, some of her efforts that she's had, because in the book she's a writer as well, and one of the reasons I went with that is because it was something that as a character she could do on the sly, and her family wouldn't know about, and that she could kind of keep quiet. And that some of her, she's very frustrated the same way that Princess Margaret was. And so she's a character that very much parallels Princess Margaret, but because she's not trapped in that world of royalty, she has the ability to walk away and find her own purpose in life. And that was not something, Princess Margaret could have done that if she'd wanted to marry Captain Townsend. She could have renounced her title. She could have walked away from it all, but she couldn't. And that actually helped define her life as well. So you see their two stories kind of diverge. And so I like the idea of just a parallel character.
Well, and Vera very much has these writer sensibilities about her. She's, I think, making her a writer really makes her an engaging character, in that we know that she is she's a bit of a troublemaker, kind of on the sly, a little bit, and I really love that about her.
Yeah, that was fun too, and that was what was fun about making her writer, is that she could do all this stuff on the sly without people finding out, especially back then, back before the internet, when
right.
You could keep things a secret, and it allowed her to also sort of build a life on the side that I think any other profession she would not have been capable of doing at that time period.
Is there ever a point in writing historical fiction, and this is, new, closer to present historical fiction than maybe the Regency stuff, but even though you're dealing with real people, real circumstances, when you get into the writing, does the story, do you ever get one of those days where the story just flows and it's just like coming out of nowhere? Do you get those same sorts of rushes when you're dealing with, with real events that you're having to structure around?
Yes, I did. There were a couple times where you get caught out a little bit, but you did get the rushes because there was so much. The nice thing about the more modern era is there is so much knowledge and information. Sometimes when you're going farther back in the past, it is really hard to find specific details about things. Whereas when it's new and I can pull up a whole bunch of newspaper articles about an event, or I can look it up in a number of books, there's a lot of inspiration there. And it was great to mine that and to run with it too, because the thing about that era is you start to get the Dior gowns, you still have balls. It's still that very elegant, and I had so much fun with that. And it was so much fun to be able to take her through all these scenes where she gets to go to a ball or a palace event, and the gown and the dresses and, the jewelry and the chauffeurs and kind of that fantasy world that we all like to indulge in a little bit when we read our historical fiction.
Right. What's interesting to see is, and the Crown, like you said, has done a great job of really giving us an insider's look at how this family operates in the world and what, how they navigate the politics and while straddling all of the historical significance of what this family is. But having Vera as a lady in waiting, we get to see what the people around them and the people connected to them who are also navigating these, sometimes the dichotomy of the old world and the new and all of that kind of stuff. What is a modern lady in waiting? What is that job like? And what kind of things did you find out about the people surrounding the royals that made that so much fun to write?
One of the things I found out is that the people that were around Margaret, part of the reason they were around her, especially in the early 50s, is that they could keep secrets, that they did not run to the press most of the time. Sharman Douglas, who was the American ambassador's daughter, who was one of Princess Margaret's friends, she had a very good relationship with the press. But what she told them was the fun stuff. We're going to be at the 400 Club this time. We're going to be doing that. The nitty-gritty details were things that her circle at that time never divulged, and they never, and most of them never would. And so that was interesting to just see that loyalty that surrounded her and that sense of closing ranks, which is part of the story too, that Vera has to then enter that world and she has to be trustworthy to keep those secrets. Whereas I think, nowadays you look at, with Princess Diana and her butler, people just spill this, and not everybody obviously, but the chance that somebody's going to spill is, I think, a lot higher, whereas back then people understood more of that sense of privacy. And I think also just looking at the way in the past, more of the accompanying Princess Margaret and doing things for her on trips, and I think some of that still does exist with the ladies in waiting, that they there's somebody there to hold the Queen's purse. There's somebody there to collect the flowers when they go and visit places and people hand them things. But I don't think it's the all-encompassing job that it was in the past. I think there's a lot more. The ladies in waiting have more of their own separate lives, whereas in the past you really did turn your life over to the royals and their whims.
In the beginning, Vera has her own hopes and dreams, and she's working on her career, and, she has aspirations, and she kind of gets pulled into Margaret's orbit. Mm-hmm. How important was it to show Vera's full character arc, so that we get some satisfaction with her character?
I think that was really important because so much of the story hinges on that, really for both characters, is that she does have her hopes and dreams, but one of them is that I want to be somebody, I want to be recognized, because she's very much, because of, I don't want to give anything away in the book, but because of things that happened after World War II, her life has not gone in a great direction. She doesn't have a whole lot of respect from her mother. She doesn't have a whole lot of accomplishments. She's just kind of drifting. And then suddenly here's this star she can hitch her wagon to that gives her all the things that she wants. But then eventually she has to decide, do I want somebody else's or do I want my own? And I think in a lot of ways it mimics the issue that Princess Margaret had, is that there were numerous times she could have chosen to go her own way, but in the end she could not give up the fact that she was a princess, that she was royal, that that's who she was, that her identity. And so you see how with Vera's character arc, she eventually makes her own decisions, and how that resolves for her, as opposed to Princess Margaret, who stayed within the royal family and within those perks of being a princess, and how that affected her life. So seeing Vera's character arc, I think, kind of gives the whole idea of, well, what if? What if Princess Margaret had said, I'm going to marry Captain Townsend, I'm going to renounce my title, I'm going to, go and just be an average person? Would she have been able to handle that life? Would she have found a great deal of happiness? It's hard to say. But I think Vera's story kind of gives you the hint that maybe if she had, maybe she would have.
Yeah, it really lets us play the what-ifs with that character. Well, now that The Other Windsor Girl is out, are you turning your gaze to another historical figure or time period?
I am. I am working on a book. It's for 2021 release, and it's tentatively titled right now The Last Debutante. And it takes place in the last London social season of 1939. And during that season, Neville Chamberlain was Prime Minister, and his niece, Valerie de Vere Cole, lived with him in number 10, and Anne Chamberlain, Neville Chamberlain's wife, brought her out into society. So she did the whole London season, but she was also living in number 10 when everything was sort of sliding towards World War II. And so the book is about Valerie, and it's about her kind of dealing with this world of glitz and glamour and the last big party before it's all about to end. And so I'm having a lot of fun right now researching that time period and London at that time, and Neville Chamberlain and Anne Chamberlain, because there really isn't a lot out there on Anne Chamberlain. She's kind of a very forgotten figure. So it's been fun to research, but it's also been fun to be able to have a little bit more leeway historically with these characters. And I'm enjoying it.
That's going to be fantastic.
Yeah, it's another round of great, balls and manor houses and dresses, but then also that dose of reality that it isn't always so great.
Yeah. It's going to be great. Well, The Other Windsor Girl, a novel of Princess Margaret, Royal Rebel, is out everywhere now. There's a link to it in the show notes. Georgie, if people are just discovering you and want to connect with you and dig into all that you do, is there a place they can find you online and connect with you?
Yes, my website is www.georgieblalock.com. I'm also on Instagram at Georgie Blalock, and I love to hear from readers, and I love to interact with people, and I love it when people come and tell me Princess Margaret stories, because I've had a couple people at signings tell me their story of when they met Princess Margaret.
Fantastic. We're going to send everyone to see you, Georgie, and thank you for taking time to come on the show today.
And thank you so much for having me on.
Now stay tuned for an audiobook excerpt from Richard Gleaves' The Jason Crane series.
I'm melting! I'm melting! Cried Joey. Take the picture already! He stood with one arm around the bronze waist of the bewitched tribute statue, Samantha Stevens, riding a broom across a crescent moon. Jason tried in vain to frame the shot without any tourists in it, but that was impossible. From all points of the compass, a merry horde had arrived for Salem's 2-day summer psychic fair. All the commuter trains had burst open, like cornucopias filled beyond capacity, spilling endless fruits and nuts onto the red brick sidewalks of Essex Street. A vampiress in lavender shorts and feathered boots sold maple chocolate walnut fudge in front of the Witch City tattoo parlor. A near-naked gypsy in purple-green veils danced with a pheasant in her arms around a plug-in Hanukkah menorah. A fat man in a fetching blue jeans dress sold amethyst and citrine charm bracelets in front of Medusa Cafe, but his stand got knocked over by a one-armed crone driving a mobility scooter who sang "Choo-choo" as she passed, her stump on the wheel, her lipstick ghastly, her gnarled right hand raised in trailing plumes of noxious cigarette smoke. Chewbacca leapt out of her way and slapped sparks from his fur. He gave a disgruntled growl before going back to playing Summer Lovin' on his ukulele. The old one-armed dervish drove off, choo-choo, parting a crowd of wanderers, slack-jawed tourists with camera straps tight across their bellies, yellow-vested police on segways, elderly rollerbladers, face-painted infants and harried parents, and college girls. So many hot, hysterical college girls that you'd think somebody had napalmed a sorority house. Jason, are you deaf? Sorry. Jason raised the phone and took the shot. Joey inspected the photo and nodded in approval. Your turn. No, thanks. Do it, Shaggy. Don't make me hex you. Jason gave in and traded places. He put an arm around Samantha's metal back. Her bronze body had flushed in the afternoon sun, warm through his glove, but her eyes were weary. No, downright creepy. And her smile was forced, like a Disneyland princess who'd had her toe stomped. "Say chowder!" cried Joey, who'd been practicing his New England accent all morning. "Come on, man. Say chowder." "Fine, chowder." Joey got the shot, and Jason surrendered Samantha to a chubby kid wearing a Gandalf beard who climbed up to worship her bronze bosom.